if someone needs a certificate which justifies presence here, or is here a sheet of paper so that you can put your name on, and also tell us whether you wish it, a certificate in Catalan or in Spanish. We are multilingual. And second point is that since courses at this university are in progress now, we have today some difficulty with this classroom, so that we must be strict this morning, just this morning, very strict. Professor Chomsky will talk till 12:05, and then we'll have a discussion till just half an hour after that, so that 12:35, till 12:35. And then at 12:35, we must leave the room till 4 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Okay. I think a little improvement, but not a lot. Yesterday, I outlined what seems to me the natural course, the proper course for a naturalistic theory of language. I didn't sketch in any details. I hope we can come back to that later. It seems to me a model of what naturalistic inquiry should be with regard to any aspect of what the phenomena that fall into the traditional domain of the mental. And again, I stress that these are not, this is no metaphysical distinction between these and others, although there may well be an epistemological distinction in that these phenomena may, to a certain extent, maybe a crucial extent, be beyond the cognitive reach of a particular creature, namely us. They might be mysteries for us, a conclusion which would not be terribly surprising. I also described a bit how the collapse of any naturalistic variety of dualism, for example, the Cartesian variety, these collapsed with Newton's demonstration that the ghostly properties of mind pervade the entire world. That is, that these are, that matter as well, down to the level of elementary mechanics, also has what are ghostly properties from the point of view of the traditional mechanical philosophy, which is a rather good expression of our common sense view of nature. With that discovery, we abandon the common sense view, at least for the purposes of theoretical inquiry, and we move to an intellectual stage where we search for the best theoretical explanation without any expectation any longer that it will conform to our intuitions or to our intuitive requirements, which simply are another phenomenon of nature that have to be explained. Well, I'll come back to further spelling out of the naturalistic point of view. That's the substantive part. But what I want to do now is to, I ended yesterday by saying that I would like to turn to approaches to the mental that reject entirely the naturalistic approach that I sketched yesterday, and insist on a kind of a radical dualism. Now, since this isn't any longer metaphysical dualism, it's a kind of methodological or epistemological dualism. Now, I stress that advocates of the positions that I'm describing would never accept this characterization of what they're doing. On the contrary, they consider themselves hard-headed scientists pursuing naturalistic inquiry in its most perfect and advanced character. But I think when I will try to show, in fact, that what they are adopting is a form of radical dualism, and a form that is completely irrational and untenable. And furthermore, I'll try to show that this is extremely pervasive. In fact, it includes virtually all of the more considered, reflective, thoughtful work on the cognitive sciences, on philosophy of mind, again, excluding the actual experimental work which goes on, with such successes as it has. Well, I mentioned yesterday that in principle we could have two people, call them Peter and Mary, and Peter and Mary might have arrived at two different I languages, let's say L1 and L2, and it might turn out that L1 and L2 have the same extension. That is, they generate the same set of linguistic expressions. That's a possibility, a theoretical possibility. It would arise from the fact that they had received a somewhat different arrangement of data, and that data had led their common language faculty to slightly different conclusions, which just happened to coincide in the linguistic expressions that they form. Now, it may be, and in fact very likely is true, that in the real world that can't happen, because the language faculty is so restrictive that it excludes this possibility. But that's an empirical issue. It has to do with the narrowness of the language faculty and the limits of the kinds of languages that it makes possible. Conceptually, there's nothing surprising about this. It could very well turn out to be the case. Now, what I've just said is commonly regarded to be completely meaningless and absurd. There's a major current of modern philosophy which considers this comment simply an absurdity. The reason is that having the same linguistic expressions means having essentially the same behavior. The way you speak, the way you understand, depends on the linguistic expressions, the collections of phonetic and semantic properties. And if two people have the same collection of expressions, they're going to react the same way to what they hear, and they're going to express themselves the same way. And over some large range of behavior, they'll be indistinguishable. And since they'll be indistinguishable over a large range of behavior, the theory has it that it is unintelligible to attribute to them different states of mind, because the states of mind that we attribute to them are just a characterization of the range of behavior that, that they undergo, that they exhibit. Similarly, suppose that in the case of Mary, I have a choice, given a fixed set of linguistic expressions, I have a choice between assigning to her language L2 or language L3, let's say, which differ in the set of linguistic expressions, or are the same. It doesn't really matter. In fact, I can put this aside. I might have it, as a scientist, I might not be certain from the data available to me whether to assign to Mary L2 or L3. Let's say, for concreteness, that they still generate the same set of linguistic expressions. And that would remain the case even if I had a theory of what's called universal grammar, that is, a theory of the language faculty, which is the same thing. Recall that the language faculty is the fixed species-specific system that permits Peter and Mary and everyone else to take certain data and to form in the mind an I language. Suppose that I have two different theories of the linguistic faculty. One of them would lead me to conclude that Mary has L2. The other one would lead me to conclude that Mary has L3. Okay, so I have theory, let's call it theory 2, which would lead me to conclude that Mary has L2, and I have theory 3 of the language faculty, which would lead me to conclude that Mary has L3. And we're assuming that they happen to converge on the set of linguistic expressions. Suppose I discover that there's somebody else, call him Wang, who speaks Chinese, and Wang gets certain data. Wang has the same brain that we have. We know that. There's no genetic adaptation to learning Chinese. In the case of Wang, suppose that theory T2 allows me to explain how Wang gets his knowledge from the data, but theory T3 doesn't allow me to explain that. If I assume that the language faculty is described by T3, and then I look at Wang, and I look at his data, and I assume that this is T3, then I come out with some I language, whatever it is, let's call it L4, which just happens to be the wrong one. I can tell by looking at Wang's behavior that it's the wrong one. It generates the wrong expressions. On the other hand, if I pick T2, then I apply it to Wang, I get some other language, which in fact is actually Chinese, and it comes out right. Okay. Now, for any scientist, any natural scientist, that would tell us that for Mary, we have to pick L2, not L3. The reason is that L2 is consistent with a more general theory of the language faculty that explains Wang as well, whereas L3 is inconsistent with that theory and is only consistent with the theory of the language faculty, which makes wrong predictions for Wang. Okay, the logic is quite straightforward, and in the natural sciences would be totally uncontroversial. However, we are instructed by philosophers that this is impermissible in the special case of language. We are not allowed to choose L2 for Mary in preference to L3 on the basis of the fact that if we choose L2, we can also explain Wang. The language that we assign to Mary has to be based solely on Mary's behavior, not on Wang's behavior. Wang's behavior is irrelevant in principle to attributing a language, often called a grammar in the literature, attributing an I language, a grammar, to Mary. That's the instruction that is handed down by the contemporary philosophical tradition. Now, this is very curious. Let's proceed. The most prominent advocate of this position, the person who more or less established contemporary analytic philosophy, for which this is a crucial principle, is Van Quine. Spoke here a couple of years ago. And Quine actually takes a still stronger position. He says that if Peter and Mary, if L1 and L2 generate the same formal language, remember that there's another notion here, formal language, which is class of well-formed expressions. And there's some problems about this. Nobody knows what it is. But let's put those aside. Let's pretend that we know what the formal language is. Well, clearly you can have different classes of expressions that coincide in their signals. They differ in all sorts of other respects, okay? Like they differ in how they associate signals with semantic properties and so on. But you could have many, many different sets of expressions which coincide with the same set of well-formed expressions, with signals, in other words. If we knew what this set was, we don't, but pretending we do. According to Quine's version, if Mary and Peter correspond in their formal languages, in the well-formed expressions, the signals that they accept, then we are not permitted to assign different, it makes no sense to say that one rather than another I language is true of Mary and Peter. And we're certainly not allowed to assign different ones to Mary and Peter. Similarly, a fortiori, we're not allowed to consider anything about Wang. That's Quine's version of this. As he puts it, if two grammars, grammar is just a term for I language, if two grammars are extensionally equivalent, meaning they're the same with regard to formal language, then it is meaningless to claim that one rather than another grammar is in the mind of the speaker. And a fortiori, it's methodologically wrong to appeal to the fact that one decision will allow us to explain Wang, whereas the other decision will leave Wang unexplained. We're not allowed to do that either, because only the class of formal expressions is allowed to, that's the database for the linguist in assigning a grammar. That's the theory. It has a kind of a motivation. The motivation is that the child learning the language only hears signals, and the child learning the language is picking up the I language from the signals, and from that Quine concludes that it is meaningless for the linguist, who he identifies with the child. It's obviously a mistake, but he identifies the linguist with the child. It is meaningless for the linguist to assign different I languages on the basis of the same set of signals, when the child just does it whatever way he does. That's the underlying motivation. I'll spell it out as we proceed. Other followers of this is what's called the radical translation model, or has various other characterizations. Other followers of Quine, like say Donald Davidson, go even further than this, while accepting this much. Donald Davidson argues that it's a mistake to try to attribute mechanisms to the speaker, to claim that what underlies the behavior is some specific set of mechanisms. As he puts it, it adds nothing to the theory of meaning. That's just a philosopher's way of talking about the theory of language. It adds nothing to the theory of meaning to assume that some mechanisms correspond to the theory. So, for example, if one could find certain cellular mechanisms that are consistent with theory T1, but are not consistent with theory T2, that would be irrelevant in principle to the linguist. So the linguist is not permitted to look at other languages. If I say I'm trying to determine Peter's I language, all I'm allowed to look at is the set of signals that Peter accepts. Maybe, if you can convince them that that's too narrow, the set of linguistic expressions that Peter has. I'm not allowed to go on to do what any scientist would do and ask whether one theory of the initial state is consistent with the biological mechanisms and another one isn't. I'm not allowed to ask whether one theory of the initial state is consistent with, say, Wang or Ahmed or, Luigi or somebody speaking a different language. Those moves are excluded. They're barred to the linguist. The linguist is not permitted to study these aspects of the brain by the methods of the natural sciences. That's the theory. Well, presumably, somebody is allowed to study these aspects of the brain. That is, the injunction doesn't seem to be that no one is allowed to study them. I mean, presumably somebody is allowed to study the mechanisms. Somebody is allowed to study the initial state and to make use of the fact that one theory of it accounts for Wang and another one doesn't. Somebody's allowed to study that, but not the linguist, by the philosopher's stipulation. Well, this is a pure terminological stipulation, obviously. So let's accept it. Who cares? We'll accept the terminology. Linguists are people who, by stipulation, are committed to total irrationality. They're not allowed to study any of the topics that anybody would investigate if they wanted to understand the nature of language. Now, having accepted that terminological stipulation, the rational move is to abandon completely the ridiculous pursuit that is now called linguistics and to turn to this other subject, whatever it is, in which we're allowed to look at Wang when we try to decide what's the right I language for Peter, and we're allowed to look at biological phenomena if we can find any. In fact, we're allowed to do anything that any normal scientist would do. In fact, that happens to be the actual practice of linguists, which is condemned in this tradition of philosophy, which in a final irony prides itself on its naturalism and its adherence to the methods of the sciences. Now, this seems to me a case of quite radical dualism. and I stress, those of you who are philosophers will know, this is a highly influential tradition. In fact, it dominates a large part of contemporary philosophy of language and mind and feeds over into the cognitive sciences. It seems to be totally irrational. You know, it seems to be a pure irrational stipulation that a certain category in one building in the university, they're not allowed to study the brain for some reason. You got to go to some other place, and there they can study it. And in that other department, they're allowed to do exactly what linguists are now doing, but they're not allowed to call themselves linguists. That's what it comes down to. So we can accept all that, recognizing that we haven't done anything except, you know, moved around, made some moves. In fact, it's rather reminiscent of a comment that Voltaire once made about metaphysics. He said, it's a game with extremely elegant moves where you always end up where you started. You know, it's more or less accurate in this case. Now, Quine himself has a further extension of this curious theory. He is willing to accept the linguist, remember, is restricted to looking at signals. Okay, just which are the well-formed expressions. And maybe, I don't know why he wouldn't, he should go on at least to say the linguist is permitted to look at the way signals are associated with interpretations in a particular community, but he's not allowed to go any further than that. However, Quine, in more recent work, has been willing to accept certain other evidence that would be relevant, and it works like this. One problem that he discusses is the problem of how to assign phrase structure. So if you have a sentence like, say, John saw Bill, there's a question whether it's, say, 3 different phrases, and that's all there is, or whether it's 2 different phrases. Too many B's here. Or whether it has some other arrangement. Those are empirical questions that one might ask. Quine has argued that there's no truth of the matter with regard to this distinction. It's anything you decide. The reason is you get the same set of signals no matter which way you do it. Okay, and that's consistent with his terminological stipulation. However, more recently, he's been willing to accept the idea that some other kinds of evidence might lead you one way or the other. The other kind of evidence is what's called psychological evidence. Psychological evidence is distinguished throughout the tradition, including the cognitive sciences. It's distinguished from linguistic evidence. So linguistic evidence, for example, would be evidence about how people understand referential relations. Okay, it turns out, for example, that if you say he thinks John is intelligent, then in English, in fact in every other language, we know that the person who says this sentence intends he to refer to someone other than John. Okay. On the other hand, if you say his mother thinks John is intelligent, then we don't know whether the speaker is referring to John when he uses he, or whether he's referring to somebody else. So there's a difference between these two expressions. Well, evidence of this kind is called linguistic evidence, and there's a whole millions of, huge amount of data of this kind. And it turns out if you use evidence of this kind across many different languages, you get quite strong arguments in favor of this analysis. It tells you this is the way it is, not that way. Then there's another class of evidence, which is called psychological evidence. An example of psychological evidence bearing on this is a set of experiments that were started by Tom Bever about 20 years ago, which refer to displacement, perceptual displacement of noises. So if you give a person a sentence, like say John saw Bill, some signal, and a person's listening to it, and you put in a noise, a click as it's called, in the course of the signal you introduce a click somewhere, And then you ask the person afterwards where they heard the click. Okay? You tell them, we ask them, where did you hear the click? What they will tend to do is to displace it to the phrase boundary. That is, they'll think they heard the click over here, even if in fact it appeared in the middle. Okay? So you tend to perceptually displace the click to the boundary of the phrases. Well, the click experiments support the idea that the big split is here, that the structure is AB, not ABC, or maybe a third possibility, DE, with the split over here. You displace the click over here, not over here. Well, Quine has agreed that that kind of evidence the linguist is allowed to use. He's allowed to use psychological evidence to determine where the phrase boundary is, but he's not permitted to use linguistic evidence, say, about referential relations, and tons of other evidence of that kind. Now that, too, is a very curious move. For one thing, because from a scientific point, first of all, evidence doesn't come divided into categories. There's no such thing as linguistic evidence and psychological evidence. I mean, evidence doesn't come with a little tag on it which says I'm linguistic evidence or I'm psychological evidence. Evidence is just evidence. In fact, it is data. It becomes evidence when you can interpret it within some sort of a theory. Otherwise, it's just, random data. So the distinction doesn't make any sense in the first place. But even granting the distinction, the story is backwards. The only significance to the click studies is that they correlate with the conclusions of linguists. The so-called linguistic evidence about the phrase boundary is vastly more convincing and persuasive on scientific grounds than the perceptual evidence. In fact, the perceptual evidence tells you nothing. From the fact that people displace the click to this boundary, you don't know whether that means the boundary's here or whether it means the boundary's here. I mean, maybe what people are doing is displacing the click to the middle of a phrase. Okay? Suppose people are displacing the click to the middle of a phrase. Well, then, these same data would tell you that the phrase boundary's got to be over here because they displace the click, or they perceptually displace the click over here. Okay, so the data tells you nothing. I mean, the only reason why people like, say, Bever and Fodor and others have interpreted the data as supporting the phrase boundary between, say, subject and predicate is because that's what the linguistic evidence shows. And the linguistic evidence is really quite persuasive. Furthermore, there's a theory about it. It fits into a theory. So it has theoretical consequences, which means there's a whole mass of indirect evidence that supports it, including evidence from Chinese, let's say, and evidence from historical change and from child language and so on and so forth. The click evidence has nothing supporting it at all. It's just an observation, just kind of like an interesting piece of data, which becomes evidence because you can interpret it in terms of the much more firmly grounded linguistic theories. Now, this is from a naturalistic point of view, but Quine takes the opposite view. His view is that the psychological evidence you're allowed to appeal to it in determining the phrase boundary, although it in fact tells you absolutely nothing. It puts the phrase boundary here if you believe that people displace clicks to the boundary. It puts the phrase boundary here if you believe that people displace clicks to the middle of the phrase. And you can just as well believe one as the other, since there's no reason to believe either. There's no theory about it, in other words. Well, again, these moves are completely baffling from a naturalistic point of view. They make all kinds of distinctions that don't exist. They put matters on their head. They interpret the powerful evidence as weak evidence and the weak evidence as powerful evidence. In fact, they make no sense at all. Now, we can work out, as a kind of psychoanalysis, you can figure out where it comes from. I mean, it comes from a picture of science as something that's done by people who wear white coats and have equipment and do statistics and that sort of thing. Science isn't what people do when they sit around and think about the structure of sentences and, you know, ask their friends what this means and so on. But that's, of course, just nonsense. I mean, the linguistic experiments on, say, referential dependence, if you wanted to, you could dress them up, too, with white coats and statistics and tachistoscopes and pushing buttons and equipment and so on and so forth. Nobody bothers to do it for a reason that's well understood in the natural sciences, which I mentioned yesterday. You never do experiments beyond the level of precision that's relevant to the questions you're asking. And the questions about phrase structure are well enough answered by the very reliable judgments about sentences like this, which indeed are extremely reliable. You can get those judgments from children, and you can get them with, they're repeatable. If you want, you could dress them up as more complicated experiments, but that would be as if a physicist were to carry out experiments, you know, to the 10th decimal place when you don't understand the 2nd decimal place. That would be pointless. You don't use more experimental precision than bears on the topic at hand. Now, there may come a time, and maybe it's already come, when linguists ought to go beyond this level of precision. I think there's some reason to believe that, and should think about more sharper experiments that separate out things that we may be mixing up and so on. If so, fine, you do better experiments. But there's no, you know, there's no break between the psychologist who's doing it with a tachistoscope and statistics and white coat and, you know, a collection of subjects and so on, and the linguist who's just asking their friends. It's all ways of getting data that you can use as evidence. And I presume that's the origin of the distinction, maybe something else. But whatever it is, it's a kind of very radical dualism and an extremely sharp departure from the natural sciences. It's hard to imagine, in fact, a sharper departure. And again, this is quite common. You know, this is accepted across a broad range as meaningful. Throughout the cognitive sciences, for example, there's lots and lots of material that claims that if linguists want to really establish their theories, they're going to have to get psychological evidence. The linguistic evidence won't do. So they'll have to get evidence from, say, click studies, which are completely meaningless. And in fact, their only significance is that there's a way of interpreting them so that they correlate with the linguistic evidence. Apart from that, they have no significance at all. But that's what people are going to have if they want to make claims about the truth about the brain in terms of its computational properties and so on and so forth. Again, these are very strange moves from a naturalistic point of view, but they are intelligible in terms of a kind of radical methodological dualism which states that you're just not allowed to study humans the way you study every other creature in the world, by stipulation. Well, another issue that arises in this connection, and that's, again, all over the place, is the matter of access to consciousness. This plays a big role in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. And so I'll give a number of different examples. One place where this shows up is in a distinction that's supposed to exist between psychological hypotheses and philosophical explanations. Again, the discussion is usually framed in terms of problems of the theory of meaning, but that's only for historical reasons. To the extent that the considerations make any sense, they would apply to the study of sound and the study of syntax and the study of everything else. Okay? It just happens that the tradition out of which they come has largely been concerned with meaning rather than phonetics, but the arguments are the same throughout. Let's take another very influential contemporary philosopher Michael Dummett from Oxford, who's one of the major modern philosophers of language and mind. Dummett has argued repeatedly over the years that we have to make a crucial distinction in epistemology and metaphysics and so on between psychological hypotheses and philosophical explanations. And here's the way it works. Let's suppose that the naturalistic approach is so successful, we'll now pretend that it's successful way beyond our fondest dreams, and suppose that it's so successful that it's able to give a complete naturalistic account of what happens when a signal strikes the ear and then gets computed through the perceptual system and the brain and feeds into a theory of action and leads to a certain action. Okay, suppose we have a theory that accounts for that whole chain. Suppose further that we've solved the unification problem. That is, we've shown how this theory of what the brain is doing relates to an account of what cells are doing. Cellular activities and chemical interactions between them and so on. So we've solved the unification problem. We have a complete theory of language going from signals all the way up to actions. Okay, let's say we've gotten that far. Well, in that case, Dummett tells us, we would have a psychological hypothesis. That is, the theory that we had constructed would be a psychological hypothesis about people. But it would not be a philosophical explanation. And the reason is, I'm quoting, because it would not tell us the form in which the body of knowledge is delivered. Remember that part of the theory, one part of this theory, which goes from signal hitting the brain, this is Peter over here, to some action. One part of it, when you tear it apart, is inside Peter's brain a cognitive system, which is an I language, in fact, it seems, which stores knowledge. And that's accessed by the performance systems. It's accessed by the perceptual apparatus and by the theory of action and so on. And Dummett's point is that even though you had a perfect theory of this by scientific standards, it would not tell us the form in which the knowledge is delivered. The idea is that in Peter's I language, in the cognitive system, there is knowledge stored. And Peter's mind accesses that knowledge to hear and to act and so on. But we don't know the form in which the knowledge is delivered to Peter. Okay, that's the idea. It's only if we knew the form in which the knowledge is delivered that we would have a philosophical explanation, not merely a psychological hypothesis. And the argument is framed particularly in connection with the theory of meaning. So that's what Dummett is naturally interested in, being a philosopher. He says if we talk about Peter's knowledge that, say, these sentences here mean what they do, we could have a psychological, suppose that my theory gave a complete scientific explanation of this distinction that I described a minute ago, which explains how Peter understands these sentences. So it's a theory of meaning. According to Dummett, that complete theory would be a psychological hypothesis about Peter's knowledge of meaning, but it would not be a philosophical explanation, and it would not permit us, it would not justify us in attributing knowledge to Peter. We would not be able to say that Peter knows the rules that lead to this conclusion. There are certain principles of the brain that lead to that distinction over here. Just to give them a name, call them binding theory. There's a part of linguistic theory called binding theory that deals with problems of this kind. And it has various principles in it which predict that things ought to come out like this across all languages. Okay? And in the psychological hypothesis, we're now pretending that everything we believe is true, and even that we've gotten way beyond what we now begin to understand. But that's okay. That's permitted in this intellectual exercise. So we're now permitting that, pretending that binding theory is in fact true and part of a comprehensive theory which is true, and it leads to the conclusion that for Peter, these two sentences are interpreted exactly the way Peter interprets them. But we're still not permitted to attribute to Peter knowledge of binding theory. We're not allowed to say Peter knows the principles of binding theory, even though binding theory is part of his cognitive system, which is accessed when he acts. Obviously, when you act, you access your knowledge or your beliefs. But we're not allowed to say that in the case of Peter. The reason we're not allowed to say it is that the reason why, as Dummett puts it, we don't know the form in which the body of knowledge is delivered, is that Peter can't tell us that he is following the principles of binding theory. In other words, if we have this kind of evidence about Peter, but if I ask Peter, are you following condition C of the binding theory, he can't say. And in fact, even if Peter is a linguist and knows what it is, you can't introspect and say, oh yeah, that's the computation that's going on in my head. You can't do that any more than if somebody asked you how you digest your food. You know, you couldn't introspect and say, okay, I do it the way the biologists say. You know, or if somebody asks you, how do you perceive a triangle? You can't introspect and say, I do it the way the visual psychologists claim I do it. Well, the binding theory is just like that. It's not available to introspection. Therefore, we don't have knowledge of the form in which we don't know the form in which the body of knowledge is delivered, and therefore we don't have a philosophical explanation. Notice that for science, the account that we're talking about tells us everything that can be asked. By assumption, it tells us everything that can possibly be asked about the form in which the knowledge is delivered. It's answered every question. We've assumed that it's answered every question that science can raise, but it hasn't crossed some bridge to philosophical explanation. Well, this seems again like a paradigm example of some kind of philosophical dualism. In the case of digestion or visual perception, we don't or say the motion of the planets, we don't insist on a philosophical explanation that goes beyond what science can deliver. That would be a joke. I mean, there was a time when people used to insist on that, but that's long gone. We now say, look, what science can deliver ends the story. But in the case of the human beings above the neck, so language, we're not allowed to do that. Now, presumably, though Dummett doesn't say so, the same would hold for sound. The same argument applies. So if I conclude that Peter judges that pin rhymes with bin, and I make up a perfect theory that explains this, that would not tell me the form in which the knowledge is delivered, and I wouldn't be able to attribute to Peter knowledge of the principles of phonology, which led to that consequence, no matter how well confirmed the theory was, and no matter how well it was unified with cellular theories. I still would have only a psychological explanation. Well, that's a very curious position. And to see how to extend the oddity of it, let's push it a little further. Suppose that there's a Martian who happens to be exactly like us. He works exactly the way we do, understands everything the way we do, has the same brain, the same theory of our brain applies to his brain. In fact, he does everything exactly the way we do. There's only one difference. The Martian has access to the Martian, the rules of binding theory are accessible to consciousness. And in fact, all the rules of the I language are accessible to consciousness. Okay, he's exactly like us, but he has a kind of an inner eye that inspects his internal computations and sees what they're doing. So if I ask the Martian, I give the Martian these sentences, and he makes the same judgments that we do by assumption. And then I ask the Martian, look, think about it. Have you applied condition C of the binding theory? And the Martian sort of thinks for a while and says, oh yeah, that's exactly what I did. you know. Just as if somebody asked you how you multiplied two numbers, you know, you might introspect for a while and say, yeah, I did it this way. Okay, the Martian can do that for condition B, C of the binding theory. And similarly, if the Martian says this rhymes with that, and I say, look, did you follow the rules of, you know, metrical phonology? He can introspect and think about it and say, yeah, those are the rules that I followed. And let's say he's even telling the truth. So he then can see the computations, just as we can introspect about the computations when we carry out a particular algorithm to solve an arithmetical problem rather than some different one. That's the only difference between the Martian and us. Now, notice for the Martian, we have a philosophical explanation of the form in which the knowledge is delivered. We've crossed this mysterious bridge because the Martian has access to consciousness. Now, in fact, we know nothing of any relevance about the Martian beyond what we know about the human, except that the Martian has this inner eye that we don't have that enables him to inspect the computations. But we're allowed to attribute knowledge to the Martian, and we're not allowed to attribute knowledge to the humans. Well, again, this simply departs radically from any approach in terms of the sciences, at least. As far as the sciences are concerned, the Martian and the human behave exactly the same way. The Martian happens to have access to computations that the human doesn't. That's an interesting question. You know, what is consciousness? What does it mean to have consciousness? Fine question, but it has nothing to do with the problem of whether Peter and the Martian are following the same rules or have the same knowledge or whatever, just irrelevant. Nevertheless, that's considered critical. The same distinction shows up in another area, what's called first-person authority. That's the technical term for it. The idea is that when I say that his mother thinks that John is intelligent, he could be referring to John. I say that with what's called first-person authority. I have supreme authority over that judgment. Nobody can question it. Okay? I have special privileged knowledge of that fact, as I have first-person authority when I look at the room and see a bunch of people. I mean, that's first-person authority. Similarly, the Martian has first-person authority when he makes the same judgments. But according to the theory, we have an we have an explanation for first-person authority in the case of the Martian. Okay, namely, he can tell us he follows the laws. But in the case of the human, the theory that I've given, this, say, perfect theory I'm quoting now, leaves the question of Peter's first-person authority a total mystery. Okay, it's left a total mystery because Peter has no access to a consciousness. That's quoting in this case an interesting article by Crispin Wright, another Oxford philosopher. Well, as far as I can see, from a naturalistic point of view, that's the wrong formulation. The theory of Peter doesn't leave first person. It doesn't make first person authority a total mystery. It leaves a mystery exactly where it was before. Namely, it leaves the mystery of consciousness. Doesn't say anything about that. That's as much a mystery after this theory is completed as it was before. But as far as first-person authority is concerned, there's no mystery whatsoever. Peter understands the sentence this way because that's the way Peter's constructed, period. There's nothing more to say. You're constructed so that you get that interpretation. That's the full account, full total account of first-person authority. There's no further question that can be asked, at least within a naturalistic framework. If something's missing, it must be because of some non-naturalistic requirement, and it would be important to bring out what that requirement is. This discussion is usually framed in slightly different terminology. In this case, the terminology again goes back to Quine, actually to Wittgenstein as well and others. It's the problem of following rules. So if Peter is using condition C of the binding theory in drawing that conclusion, the linguist would like to say Peter is following the rule, condition C. And that's how Peter draws the conclusion that these sentences have the interpretation that they have. Okay. Now that's supposed to be a big problem. There's supposed to be a mystery about the notion of following rules. Quine has suggested, again, that we resolve the mystery by making a distinction between two notions of following rules. One is the notion of fitting rules. Rule here is a very broad notion. It includes, for example, law of nature. Includes law of nature, principle of grammar, rule of chess. It's a very broad notion. Okay. So Quine suggests that we distinguish between fitting rules or laws and so on and being guided by rules. Okay? Is that we clarify this mystery by making that distinction. Okay, now how does that work? Well, according to Quine, let's take, say, Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Planets move in ellipses and so on. Quine says in that case, we should say that the planets fit the rules. They fit Kepler's laws, but they aren't guided by Kepler's laws. So the planet doesn't think, I'd like to follow Kepler's laws, so therefore I'll move over here. Okay. Rather, the planet just acts in such a way that it fits the laws. Okay. On the other hand, a person is guided by rules, and this is only people, if the person consciously explains that that's what I'm doing. So, for example, if I'm driving a car and there's a red light and I stop and somebody says, "What did you do?" and I think about it and I say, well, there's a law, there's a rule that says you're supposed to stop when there's a red light, and that's what I did. I followed that rule. And if that description is in fact true, then we can say that the person's guided by the rule. So those are the two categories. You're guided by rules when you can say truly that those are the rules you're following, and otherwise you just fit rules, nothing else. Notice that this excludes Peter. Peter, who the linguist would like to say, the scientist would like to say, is following the rules of binding theory, certainly isn't guided by them. He can't tell you that that's what he's doing. The Martian is guided by them because he can say so, but Peter isn't. So all we're allowed to say in this case is that Peter fits the rules the way the planets fit Kepler's laws. We're not allowed to say that these rules are part of Peter's cognitive system and that he accesses them and so on. In other words, this perfect theory that we had, we pretended that we had a perfect theory of this. We got to throw it out, okay? Because that theory goes beyond fitting. It actually attributes the rules to Peter. But according to Quine's notion, no matter how successful that theory is, it can achieve perfect success from a scientific point of view, but we have to throw it out anyway. And all we're allowed to say of Peter is that he follows the rules of binding theory, but they're not part of his constitution. Okay, that's the stipulation. Now, here too, there are some very curious moves. In fact, there are even some curious moves about fitting rules. So take the example of Kepler's laws. Actually, the astronomer, the physicist, doesn't just say the planets fit Kepler's laws. What the physicist does is attribute to the planets a certain property, namely mass. The physicist attributes mass to the planets. That's a property. The physicist states certain laws, say Newton's laws. And then it follows that because the planets have the property mass, given Newton's laws, it's going to behave in accordance with Kepler's laws. I mean, that's the actual step that's made. So the analog over here, in the case of Peter, if we want to say that Peter just fits the laws of binding theory, we have to do what the physicist does. We have to attribute to Peter some property from which it will follow by the laws of nature that Peter draws those conclusions. That would be treating Peter like the planets. Well, what property do we attribute to Peter? We could attribute to him mass, but nothing's going to follow from that. I mean, from attributing to Peter mass, it's not going to follow that he interprets these sentences this way. So that's not enough. We have to attribute to Peter richer properties than that. Well, in fact, for a scientist, the properties that you would attribute to Peter are the properties stated by the structure of this theory. You would say that I'm attributing to Peter a property of having a brain with a language faculty and a cognitive system which includes binding theory and a performance system which accesses it and so on. That whole complex of material is the property that I'm attributing to Peter, just as I attribute mass to the planets. If some thing up there in the sky didn't have mass, it wouldn't follow like Kepler's laws. And if Peter didn't have this structure, it wouldn't follow the laws of nature and yield these conclusions. However, we're not allowed to make that move in the case of Peter, again, by stipulation, another form of radical dualism. In fact, when people talk about following rules, it's within the category of fitting rules, but where you're allowed to attribute to the person the properties which would account for why they fit the rules. And by stipulation, the linguist and the psychologist are not allowed to do this. I mean, maybe the psychologist, but not the linguist. And again, that's a pure dualist stipulation. There's a whole huge literature following this distinction. The person who's developed it furthest is John Searle, in a series of articles and actually a new book, which I haven't seen yet. I think it's just come out. Searle was, he insists strongly, as most philosophers and cognitive scientists do, that access to consciousness is the crucial criterion for attributing rule following. The Wittgensteinians more or less do that too, although it's a little more qualified. But Searle explicitly demands that. His demand is, it's nonsense, it's an absurdity to speak of Peter following rules unless Peter can tell you that that's what he's doing. So we're not allowed to do what the scientist would do in this case, okay? Now, Searle, however, has recognized that there are certain, kind of paradoxes that follow from this insistence. One thing that's bothered him is a phenomenon that in the psychological literature is called blind sight. It was discovered some years ago that if a person suffers a certain kind of damage to the visual cortex, say maybe some part of the visual cortex is removed, then in some area of the visual field, the person has no awareness of seeing anything, looks blank. On the other hand, under some cases, it turns out that you can show experimentally that the person really is seeing something. So if you take the area, suppose the person, this is the area of the visual field for which some person who's had a brain operation has no awareness. And if you draw in there, let's say a cross or a circle, and you just force the person to make a choice. I mean, you ask the person, do you see anything? They say, no, I don't see anything. And they say, well, okay, you don't see anything, but just tell me, what do you guess? Is it a cross or a circle? And the person will make the right choice. And they'll say, yeah, it's a cross. If it's a cross, it's a circle if it's a circle. If you put over here a picture, let's say, of a house on fire, and you put over here in another portion of the blind visual field a picture of a house that's not on fire, all of this in the blind area, and you ask the person, what do you see? They'll say, you see nothing. And they'll say, okay, you see nothing, but extend your hand to some place where it won't get burned. Okay? And then the person will extend their hand here, not here. And there's a whole pile of stuff like this. So that's the phenomenon called blind sight. Well, here there's obviously a kind of problem arising for this rule-following business. Because if you take Quine seriously, you'd have to say that the person with blind sight, there's every reason to believe that the person is perceiving the cross and the circle and the house on fire just the way he did before. He just doesn't have any awareness of it. And Quine would be forced to say, and Dummett and so on, that the person is no longer following rules, even though he's doing exactly what he did before. And that Searle recognizes would be kind of paradoxical, and he doesn't want to draw that conclusion. So he introduces a distinction between what he calls blockage and inaccessibility in principle. Okay, so that's a distinction. In the case of the man with blind sight, he only has something called blockage. That is, he doesn't have inaccessibility in principle to the to what he's perceiving. It's just some interference, blockage. So now we have that distinction. On the other hand, in the case of Peter, following the rules of binding theory, it's inaccessibility in principle. Okay. Well, suppose we pursue this argument further, and let's go back to the Martian who talks English and has complete access to all the rules. Remember, for the Martian, there was no problem. The Martian was like, had accessibility to the rules. Suppose the Martian has a brain injury, okay? And now he's just like the person with blind sight. He keeps talking exactly the way he talked before, which by assumption is the same way we do. He acts just like before, but he's lost the inner eye. The brain injury has eliminated his ability to access the computations. Okay. Now, according to Searle, this has got to be blockage. It can't be inaccessibility in principle, right? In fact, it's exactly the same case. Just as the person who's with brain damage lost access to awareness but is acting as before and therefore only has blockage, the Martian who through a comparable brain injury has lost access only has blockage, not inaccessibility in principle. So the Martian is still following the rules, just as the guy with blind sight is still seeing, but without awareness. Okay. Suppose now that, notice that the Martian is now indistinguishable from us. In fact, this brain injury might have turned the Martian into a human. In fact, that's exactly what it might have done. In fact, suppose the Martian had some little component up there, which was what was making it possible for the Martian to inspect his computations and say, yeah, it's binding theory. And suppose the operation just cut that out. Well, now the Martian's indistinguishable from humans, but the Martian only has blockage and is still following the rules, while the human is not following the rules because of inaccessibility in principle. Now let's carry it a step further. Suppose that among Martians, somebody's born with a certain genetic defect, and the genetic defect makes the guy indistinguishable from the person with the brain injury. Okay? In other words, the genetic defect just didn't allow that part of the brain to grow. Well, what about this person? This person is now identical with the Martian with blockage and identical to Peter, but it wasn't caused by a brain injury, it was caused by the genes. Well, presumably, we have to decide what we're going to say in this case. Unless we want to return to absurdity, we would have to say that the Martian with the genetic defect still just has blockage. He's exactly like the other Martians, but something went wrong with his brain, even though he's now born identical with humans. Suppose now that this genetic defect is perpetuated for, thousands of years, and there's a whole race of Martians, all of whom have the same genetic defect, and suppose by now they've come down to Earth, and they're all intermingled with us, and since they're identical with us, we can't tell any difference between them. We would still have to say, by this reasoning, that these Martians, sort of scattered around the audience here, have only blockage, whereas the rest of them, humans who have some other evolutionary origin, they have inaccessibility in principle. And the Martians among us are following rules, but the humans are not. In fact, it could be that that's the reality. Maybe there was an invasion, 50,000 years ago, of Martians with genetic defects, and now half of you are descended from Martians and half from humans. But some of you are then following rules and others aren't, and we have no way of telling. That's what we're forced to if we pursue this line of reason. And if you want to push it further, you can go further. It's sort of becomes obvious that something's gone wrong. In fact, to stop this course of absurdity from proceeding, we would have to cut it off at the first step and say there couldn't be a Martian who is just like Peter, except that he has access to consciousness. If we allow the possibility of such a species, we go off into this absurdity. So therefore, in order to block the absurdity, we have to say there couldn't be such a species. Well, we now have the philosopher making a very curious empirical assumption about the possibility of certain species. The philosopher is now driven to an empirical assumption that goes way beyond any biological knowledge, that says certain kinds of species are impossible according to the laws of nature. Now, when philosophy is driven to a crazy empirical assumption, you know that something's very wrong. And tracing it back to the origins, what's wrong is the whole idea that you're not allowed, that access to consciousness has any relation whatsoever to attributing rule following. It has no relation whatsoever to it. Therefore, we just go back to the naturalistic interpretation, and access to consciousness is an interesting question, fine question. Just has nothing to do with rule following and so on. Well, here again is in this naturalistic approach, which is post-Newtonian. That's the one form of post-X that I understand. So it's post-Newtonian. In this, we just look for the best theory. We look for the best theory. And if the best theory that we can find tells us Peter's following rules, well, in Peter's following rules, we have no higher criterion to which we can appeal. In the post-Newtonian era, there is no privileged category of evidence, like, say, linguistic evidence or psychological evidence. There's no notion of philosophical explanation that goes beyond psychological hypothesis, and there's no notion of, say, blockage versus access or any such mysterious inventions which are introduced in an effort which is certain to be a vain effort to keep the whole thing from collapsing into absurdity. It just forces you into absurdity. I should say these questions have been raised to John Searle in particular, and I don't see any answers to them. It seems to me he kind of skirts the questions. Now maybe the new book, which I haven't seen yet, says something about it, but I'll be very surprised. Maybe, I don't know if any of you, I doubt if anybody's seen it yet. It's just appeared. It's about the topic. But it seems to me he has to answer these questions. Unless he can answer these questions and similar other ones like it, the whole project totally collapses. And with it, the whole Quine project, which is based on the distinction between guiding and fitting, both of which are misinterpreted. Fitting is misinterpreted because it fails to notice that the planets fit the rules by virtue of property that they have, and guiding is misinterpreted because it's far too narrow. It's just based on the arbitrary stipulation that access to consciousness is a critical criterion, which makes no sense in the first place, and the fact that it makes no sense quickly shows up as you pursue it on the path, this and other paths, which quickly lead to absurdity. Now, in the case of the Wittgensteinian variant of this, or say Saul Kripke, who's developed it further, there's a somewhat different view of the matter. In the Wittgensteinian version, there's also a big discussion about following rules, but the examples are typically rules of arithmetic. So how do we decide? We see somebody multiplying numbers, 2 times 3 equals 6, and things like that. And we see that person multiplying lots of numbers. How do we know that the person is following the rule of multiplication? How do we know that when you get to, 5 times 25, it's not all of a sudden going to be, 12,862? After all, that's a rule too. There's a perfectly good rule of arithmetic that says multiply the normal way up to big numbers, pick some point, and from that point on, make all the products equal to pi, let's say. Okay, that's a perfectly good rule of arithmetic, and how do we know that the person's not following that rule? And as Wittgenstein points out, no matter how much evidence you have, you never know that. I mean, you might decide that, you might have the hypothesis that when you get to 100, all the products go up to pi, and then when you get that far, you'll find you were wrong, but you can say, when you get to 1,000, after that, they're all equal to pi. And for every mass of evidence that you accumulate, you're always going to have these further hypotheses. So he concludes, you can never say that the person's following the rule. It's kind of like a paradox. And Kripke, in a recent book, I forget what it's called. What's the name of Kripke's recent book on Wittgenstein? Somebody's got to remember. Well, whatever. He develops this much further. Well, whatever the significance of any of this may be, we can put it aside because the rules are not relevant. These rules are rules of a totally different category. The rules of binding theory, the rules that Peter is following, are laws of the natural world. They're like Kepler's laws or Newton's laws. It's a law of the natural world, it is claimed, that if you have a brain organized in terms of principles of binding theory embedded in a performance system of a certain type, you'll understand sentences in a certain way. That's just a more complicated variant of Newton's laws, let's say. And questions do arise about the validity of natural laws, but those are just normal questions of inductive uncertainty. And as I said at the beginning, general questions that arise for physics don't have to trouble us when we're doing psychology. You want to find the answers to those questions, go to physics. But there's no point in raising for psychology or linguistics exactly the kinds of questions of, say, inductive uncertainty or accuracy of, legitimacy of theoretical postulates that arise for the most advanced sciences and arise necessarily, and in fact can't be overcome. And we know that they can't be overcome. They're just an inherent property of natural inquiry. It was well understood by the 17th century, after the Cartesian crisis of skepticism. It was well understood by people like Gassendi and others that the problems of induction are inherently insoluble. All we can do is realize that we have some method of gaining better and better understanding while knowing that it can't have any absolute grounding. We realize that. That's the result of the skeptical crisis. And that's basically the position of the natural scientist, and it's a fair position, and we can adopt it too. So those questions don't arise. As to the specific questions that arise in the case of arithmetical rules, they are irrelevant because the arithmetical rules are stipulated. those are rules of a totally different type. They're rules which we stipulate. We stipulate that plus is going to mean so-and-so, okay? And if you don't follow that, you're just not following my stipulation. That's like turn right on red or something. No, it's a stipulation. And yeah, we can't be sure that people are following stipulations, but who cares? It's not relevant. So that kind of consideration, the Wittgenstein-Kripke kind, we can put aside. We're simply concerned with rules that are of the type of natural laws, rules that Peter follows because that's the way Peter's constituted, period. Nothing more to say about it. Now we have to be careful here to distinguish two ways in which people can follow rules. So for example, I know that the word chair, let's say, can be used to refer to this kind of thing, but can't be used to refer to this kind of thing. Well, that's following a rule, okay? Or I know that these sentences, which I've since erased, have the meanings that they do and not other meanings. And when I give them those meanings and use them in those ways, I'm following the rule. Now, I could choose consciously to violate those rules in a certain sense. I could use the word chair to refer to tables. In fact, we might make up a code, let's say, in which we want to confuse spies or something. And you and I might decide, okay, when we want to refer to a table, we'll say chair. Or I could take these sentences and we could make an agreement that we're going to interpret them, you know, so that the first sentence means the planes are leaving the air base, and the second sentence means set off the bomb on the battleship or something, as in a code. We could certainly do that, and in that case, we wouldn't be following the rules. Of course, we would know, because we can't help knowing it, that chair means chair, and that the properties of reference there are the properties of reference there. But we could choose to just overlook that fact and to use these physical objects in some other fashion. Well, that's a distinction in rule following that has to be borne in mind, but it plainly has no bearing on this question. I'm turning to another example. Maybe this would be a good point to stop. I want to turn next to further examples of this dualism and continue to try to show that it indeed is all-pervasive, that virtually nothing in the field is not infected by it. But let me hold that one off till this afternoon.
It seems to me that the limitations on the relevant evidence that are put by the methodological dualism that you mentioned is it certainly is irrational a priori, but is even more irrational a posteriori, considering that there's mounting converging evidence coming from different subfields of the study of cognitive capacities such as language that strongly support the same structural hypothesis. One case is provided by the study of brain damage. Just to take a very simple example, there's work by Karamazza and others strongly support the behavior of brain damaged patients, strongly supporting the distinctions between inflectional morphology and derivational morphology. So how we inflect words like eaten and the creation of new words like read, readable, readability, and so on and so forth. What I observe is that there's a very sharp dissociation of these processes, in that some patients are selectively affected on one and not on the other. And it seems to me that this sort of evidence is now becoming more and more sophisticated. Just to mention a very recent work concerning different types of WH dependencies, question formation. There are good linguistic, quote-unquote, reasons
to distinguish the kind of dependency that exists in cases of WH elements like who and which boy. In that, for instance, in some languages, if you try to extract these elements from an indirect question, you get a better result with which boy rather than who. In some languages, which boy type questions involve pletic doubling. So you say things like, which boy did you see him? But not who questions. So who did you see? No, who did you see him? And there are also differences involving verb second type phenomena between these two elements. There is interesting evidence of the Bever kind, also suggesting that the type of relation between who and which boy type WH element and the empty element in object position is not quite the same. And there is, I think, extremely interesting neuropsychological evidence suggesting a dissociation. For instance, researchers at MIT have shown recently, have looked at cases of agrammatic patients that make a very sharp dissociation between the two types of A-bar dependencies, thus supporting that sort of distinction. All these types of converging evidence would simply not be consistent, seems to me, if one adopted the strongest position of methodological dualism.
I know, from a naturalistic point of view, that's obviously correct. But what Quine would surely say, if you gave him that evidence, is exactly what he said when somebody pointed out to him the click evidence, that this kind of evidence does allow us to establish hypotheses. So if Karamazov has distinguished, say in aphasia or whatever, between inflectional and derivational morphology, there's a distinction. We're allowed to attribute it to the brain. But if some linguistic theory makes crucial differences between inflectional and derivational morphology to explain linguistic phenomena, we're not allowed to do it. And I think the relationship between the categories of evidence here still is the same as in the case of the clicks. Karamazov's evidence and the evidence about WH and so on are of significance for the moment, primarily because of their correlation to the linguistic categories. I mean, if Karamazov were just to look at the brain without any idea about language, he'd find millions of different kinds of distinctions. Most of them would be totally irrelevant to anything. He picks these to be relevant because there is a reasonably well-established theory that makes those distinctions. So it's kind of like the relation between chemistry and physics 100 years ago. The chemists had very good reasons for putting things in the periodic table the way they were, and for classifying types of matter the way they did. The physicists had no special reason for why things should be that way. The chemistry was a kind of a guide to the revision of physics. Ultimately, it had to be a big revision that said, look, these are the kind of things you got to look for. You have to look for the difference between solid and liquid, you know, organized matter and non-organized matter. And you have to look for the fact that sodium is yellow necessarily, and so on. Those are the things you have to explain. And it seems to be in the brain sciences or psychology, the way the fields are now, you know, the way the theories now stand, it's the better grounded computational representational theories, which by and large are providing the guidelines for research. But of course, the more converging evidence you get from different sources, the more irrational it becomes to take one major source of evidence and the well-established conclusions that follow from it and say that wasn't allowed. I have no idea how philosophers in this tradition are going to react to this kind of material as it continues to pile up.
I wanted to comment that obviously Wittgenstein has much more on following rules. And even in philosophical investigations, he has a very nice list, open list of different modalities, saying, well, being guided by a partner in a dance, walking across a field, etc., which I think adds a lot to Quine's distinction.
It's perfectly true that Wittgenstein has many cases, but all the cases fall into the notion of rule that involves norms. You know, conventional norms, community norms, something like that. As far as I know, every example is like that.
You can interpret rules in very different ways. If there's a finger pointing there, you can interpret it pointing at yourself.
Right. I understand.
It's very much to your point. I mean that he makes a very nice analysis of access to consciousness. I mean, what does access to consciousness mean?
Well, one of Wittgenstein's examples is that if I point over there, there's no way of telling from the gesture itself whether I'm pointing in that direction or in that direction. I mean, maybe when I stretch my arm that way, I mean you to extrapolate gaze backwards so that you look at what's over there. Well, Wittgenstein is not, you know, the least obscure writer in history, and it isn't very clear what he concludes from that. What he ought to conclude from it, and I don't know that this is what he does conclude, is that you extrapolate your gaze that way and not that way because that's the way we're constituted. We're built that way. That's the kind of organisms we are. We have no choice about how to interpret this gesture because it's part of our nature. So the fact that some other creature might interpret it another way is irrelevant. You know, it's like saying that in some other world, planets might not satisfy Kepler's laws. Okay, so it's just a fact about nature. It's a biological fact. Now, I don't see what that has to do with his whole story about rule following. He seems to think it means something different, but I don't know what. You know.
I'm not sure it's a fact by nature, because when you have small children, I've tried that experiment, and you try to show them something by pointing out so. Some of them look at your finger, not at what you are pointing to, so that it's not absolutely clear what you are doing for them.
I don't agree with that. It's true that some of them look at your finger, but that's a matter of development. No child is taught to extrapolate gaze, to extrapolate the arm. There is a stage when, if you raise your finger, an infant will look at your finger. There's another stage when you go like this, and the child will extrapolate the length of your arm, and no instruction has taken place in between. So it's just some developmental process.
Without instruction, you think so?
Just has to be. I mean, any parents can think back and ask when they've tried to teach their children that they're supposed to look that way. You know?
But
in fact, you couldn't do it. You couldn't do it if you tried. You wouldn't know how to do it. Interestingly,
but of course,
young infants.
But of course you do, because on the contrary, he would, the child would all the time look at your, at the top of your finger.
It's only an infant. An infant will look at your finger, but as soon as the child has matured properly, the child starts pointing before people do. One of the earliest actions of children is to point and ask for the name. And at that point, they're already using gestures as pointing gestures. In fact, there's been some study of this. There's a very interesting study, but mostly by a woman named Laura. Where are the double T's? I keep forgetting. 2 T's? Petito. 2 T's?
I know. First time one.
First time one. Okay. Now, Laura Petito, who's been studying, she was particularly interested in development of sign in children. And she discovered some quite remarkable things about pointing in extremely young children, like children a year old and so on. It turns out, in sign language, like, say, American Sign Language, pointing gestures are used for reference, like you is that, and me is this. Okay, so pointing gestures have referential content. But it turns out that those referential gestures, which are like pronouns, develop quite separately from the normal pointing gesture, you know, pointing at something because you want somebody to look over there. In fact, they develop so separately that they sometimes work in contradiction. There's an early stage of child language, which anybody who's watched children remembers, where a child will use the pronoun you to refer to himself and refer to I to refer to you. And it's sort of obvious why. You know, the child hears himself referred to as you, so he figures that's my name, you know. And he sees that person referred to as I, so he figures that's your name. So there is a stage that children go through where they invert the pronouns. I is that person over there, and you is me. So a child will say, pick you up, meaning pick me up. Okay, that's standard, in fact, virtually universal. Well, it turns out that the signing kids use the sign symbols counter-iconically. That is, they use this symbol to refer to you, and that symbol to refer to me, counter-iconically. At the same time that when they're pointing, they use them iconically. Okay? And these systems develop in parallel, though they mean opposite things at this stage. Now, in both the development of gesture and straight gesture in deaf children and hearing children, the development is exactly the same and completely independent of any parental interaction. It nevertheless does remain true that if you take a 6-month-old infant and you stick out your finger, the infant will look at your finger. But that's just a developmental fact. I mean, there comes a point where, in fact, infants even extrapolate eye gaze. So an infant will look at, you can be looking at something, and the infant at some level will look at you and look at the thing you're looking at. That's a pretty amazing computation. I think that other primates aren't capable of that, as far as anybody knows. And notice that that's a crucial prerequisite to learning names. You have to know what the person's attending to. So if the mother is looking at that, the child can look at the mother's eye and figure out that the mother's looking that way, and will then look that way. So it's not, and certainly no child has ever taught that. I mean, that's out of the question. But that's just another form of extrapolation of arm. So all of this thing comes along. It all comes very early, very, very early. It sometimes even works contrary to picking up of referential gestures, as in the sign case. You know, it just looks like normal biological development, like learning to walk. I mean, children aren't taught to walk. They just walk at a certain stage. True, at an earlier stage, they crawl, but they're not taught to walk. And similarly, at an early stage, they look at your finger. At a later stage, they extrapolate arms, but they're never taught to do it. And in fact, the effort to teach would be impossible. You know, nobody can even dream up a teaching procedure that would work. This eye gaze business is kind of amazing, in fact. As you all know, when you can look at a person, and you know when they're looking at you. And some sort of instinctive reaction that we have, which must go way back in evolutionary history, prevents us from looking at people. Because if you're talking to somebody and you look into their eye and you see that they're looking at you, somehow that establishes too much intimacy or something, and you have to look away. You know? So your automatic reaction is to look away. And if you keep looking, it's frightening. It frightens the person if you keep looking. I mean, unless there's some special relation of intimacy or something like that. And these are extremely subtle calculations. I mean, to decide whether a person is looking at you requires a very precise calculation. You know? And the whole instinctive background that tells us how to respond to it, you know, like looking a little bit away when you're talking to somebody, it must be very deep in our evolutionary history.
Yeah, returning to Emeritus' point, it seems to me that although in principle you can sort of agree on the fact that if there is some convergence from evidence, of evidence from different fields, okay, that's supposed to be not casual, and there must be some reason for it. Still, in the case of linguistics, the relationship is quite uneven. So, for one thing, if imagine that you get a negative result, so somebody working in neurobiology or something gets something which is, suggests that there is no distinction between inflection and derivation. I guess that, well, most linguists would do is assume that this is caused by something else, right?
And actually, the neurophysiologist should assume the same thing. I mean, it's extremely easy. There's nothing easier than to do irrelevant experiments. In fact, most experiments are just irrelevant. You know, if you pick an experiment at random and you do it, you'll get meaningless data. It takes an awful long time to get data that actually means something. So say, take the click experiments. I mean, it's not that Tom Bever and Jerry Fodor decided to study click displacement and found this thing. What happened is they had this idea that maybe there would be click displacement. And they did experiments, and they came out with completely crazy results. So they changed the experiments, and then they came out with better results. And they kept refining the experiments until they had found experiments that gave them what they knew had to be true, namely that you get displacement to the phrase boundary. And an awful lot of experimental work is like that. I mean, they don't tell you about that when they write a scientific paper. But anybody who's an experimental scientist knows perfectly well that an enormous part of the effort is trying to find an experiment that's not stupid, because most experiments are just stupid. You know? If somebody comes along with a stupid experiment that says, I can't find any relation between this and that, the usual answer is go back and design a better experiment. One of the things you learn as an experimental scientist is that the process of designing a correct experiment is like the process of designing a good theory. You know, it's very similar. They don't just come along. You've got to refine them and modify them and see what's going wrong and eliminate interfering factors, and ultimately, if you're lucky, you'll get an experiment which shows something. And usually that means bears on some theoretical assumption. Now, in the case of the inflection and derivation, there is a theoretical assumption, namely that they're different, and there's a lot of evidence for it. So the neurophysiologist will try to find experiments that show something going on in the brain that correlates to that. There are millions of experiments that will show no correlation. In fact, almost any one you do at random will show no correlation.
It's about Dummett's explanation. I don't understand what he means. My problem is with the word form. What does form means? It means, Dummett, that there is a form. There is a form, or a system of forms. There is. And then we don't know that. Or that he means that we don't have a theory yet, and that we must construct a theory.
Well, let's go back to the concrete case. So let's take the example that I gave. Okay, he thinks John is intelligent. His mother thinks John is intelligent. Now, if Peter says that, if Peter says this one, I know that Peter is intending to refer to two different people, one of them John, and one whoever he is in this discourse. Okay. If Peter says this one, I don't know that. He might be intending to refer to two different people, or he might be intending that this pronoun refers to John. Okay, he might be. So I know something about the meaning of those two cases. That's just a fact. You know, it's like the fact that sodium is yellow. Okay, just a phenomenon. You can make that fact as reliable as you like. You know, do the very tight experiments. You find it in other languages, you know, so on. So without knowing Catalan, you know, something similar will be true. You know. Now, so we have a fact. All right, there is theory. It's called binding theory, which deals with a wide array of facts of that type. There's a whole mass of them. They have to do with pronominal dependence, the conditions under which a pronoun can be dependent, can pick up its reference from something else. And it's a rich theory with a lot of results. All right, Dummett is willing to agree to that. He says that this theory is a psychological hypothesis. In fact, even if we improved this theory we expanded it so that it didn't only cover these phenomena, but it covered all phenomena of language, it would still just be a psychological hypothesis. And even if we improved this theory further so that we related it to, you know, activities of cells, we said that when I make this judgment, the cells in my brain are doing so and so, and when I make this judgment, the cells in my brain are doing such and such, and some arrangement of cells expresses this. Even if we did all of that, we'd still only have a psychological hypothesis. We would not yet have a philosophical explanation for meaning. That's his claim. And his claim is that we cross that bridge from psychological hypothesis to philosophical explanation only when the person is guided in Quine's sense. That is, can tell us that these are the rules they're following. So if the Martian can introspect and say, I'm following the rules of binding theory, then we have a philosophical explanation. We know the form in which the knowledge is presented. Otherwise, we don't. And if we've crossed that bridge, we're now allowed to attribute knowledge to Peter. We're allowed to say Peter knows the principles of the binding theory. If we haven't crossed that bridge, we're not allowed to do it. Well, as far as I can see, you can look at this theory in two different ways. You can say it's just a bunch of terminological stipulations. Okay. In that case, it's of no interest. I mean, if that's what philosophers want to say, if that's the way they want to use words in the Oxford Senior Common Room, fine. You know, it has nothing to do with knowledge. It has nothing to do with people. It has nothing to do with rule following. It just has to do with certain odd conventions in Oxford Senior Common Rooms, like which are on a par with whether you drink port before meals or after meals. It's something like that. On the other hand, if they think they're saying something that has some significance, either for philosophy or for science or for human life and so on, then they have a lot of explaining to do. They have to explain why any of this matters. And they also have to explain their way out of strange paradoxes that result if you pursue it, like the case that I went through in the Searle case. So I think they have a lot of explanation to do. Either it's just terminological stipulation, or else there's some explaining to do. Now, nobody has tried the explanation. It's considered self-evident. So, for example, in Dummett's latest book, which is the one I'm quoting from, he sort of just presents this as a kind of side comment on why he rejects linguistic explanations in the theory of meaning. He says, well, we obviously reject these because they don't tell us the form in which knowledge is presented, and therefore don't give us philosophical explanations. But that's not enough. No, I mean, it's not enough to reject it that way. There are questions to answer. Now, I think if we sort of think about the cultural history of philosophy, we can guess what the explanations are. You know, this is now trying to look at philosophy the way a cultural anthropologist would look at a tribe in Central Australia. You know, we can try to figure out how they're getting to the curious positions that they're getting to. And I think it's easy. If you know the background, you can sort of see it. You can see what might have led somebody to this position. Part of what's leading to that position is a classical education. Almost all of these people have gone through a classical education. In a classical education, you're taught something about language. I mentioned yesterday, I forget when, was it here or somebody else? I mentioned to someone yesterday that I had just come from Oxford where I was talking about these things. And after a lot of discussion about it in the senior common room, which is where everybody's life goes on, a very distinguished philosopher told me that he thinks all the stuff we're doing is kind of interesting, but it's not about language, because the only language is Attic Greek. That's the only language. And that's the one he learned when he was a student at Oxford. Now, Attic Greek is an interesting... Why is Attic Greek a language? Well, because there's a fixed, closed text. You know, it's finished. You know, you can say, here it is. It's these texts. Furthermore, there's a bunch of guys who wrote some rules, and they say these are the rules of Attic Greek. Now, in fact, those rules come nowhere near describing the texts, but they don't know that because they didn't think about syntax and semantics and so on. The rules, in fact, describe very peripheral aspects of the text, but you're not taught that when you get a classical education. What you're taught is memorize these texts, memorize the rules determine the texts. When you have a composition, like you have to write a composition for your teacher, you're supposed to follow the rules in the sense of putting together the constructions the way it says in that rule book. Okay? And I think that's the model people have in mind. Okay? Well, if you have that model in mind, you could very well be led to this. I mean, the model is, you know, completely wild. But if that's the model that you have in mind, you could very well be led to these conceptions of rule following, language, knowledge. See, in the case of knowledge of Attic Greek, what it would mean is having memorized those rules. The rules are there in a book, and you got to study them if you want to, you know, get a high degree at Oxford. And you memorize the rules, and you know them all by heart, and then you know Attic Greek. Okay? And I think that's the model that people have in mind. And that carries over to all of these discussions.
Yes, now going back to those so-called psychological data bearing on linguistic theory, I would like to know about your opinion on the relation or conversion or whatever, if any, between data from language processing in real time and linguistic theory.
Literature.
Data on language processing in real time and linguistic theory, on experiments.
Real-time experiments
in language processing and linguistic theory.
Well, I think that's the kind of thing that Luigi was actually referring to. Real-time linguistic processing, you know, has the usual problems. It's easy to do irrelevant experiments. And it's only quite recently that people have started doing experiments which are quite intriguing. So, for example, there's experiments on what's called priming effects. Okay, so you play a signal to somebody, and at some point you ask them a question about something that happened before. You know? I mean, you can ask the question sort of indirectly, like maybe some word appeared here, and you give them another word that's in the same semantic category, and you ask how long it takes to remember for them to think of it or find it or something. Well, what's been done is to take various what are called empty elements that are there in the mental representation, but don't have any sound. You don't pronounce them. So there are empty, like when Catalan, for example, there are empty pronouns. You mean he, but you don't say it. You know, you just say nothing. And there's a whole variety of these things that have different types. in linguistic theory, they fall into many different categories. For example, if you say, who did John see? There's good reason to believe that there's an empty category over here, and that you're interpreting who as being a kind of an operator binding a variable which is actually here. And there's good reason to believe that in the mental representation it is actually there. The mind sees it. It's only that the voice doesn't pronounce it. Okay. Well, and there's a number of different types. Well, the priming experiments, which are real-time processing, have gotten sophisticated enough so they're beginning to be able to make distinctions between the kind of priming of earlier things that you could ask about a pronoun and its antecedent, or one of these things and a quantifier, and there are all these relationships. And they're beginning to find different kinds of relationships for different kinds of elements. Okay, that's real-time processing work that's very intriguing. It's intriguing, again, for the same reason. It's beginning to give evidence about processing, which is meaningful evidence, because it correlates with categories that are pretty firmly established from other points of view. Now, notice that there could well come a time when this evidence gets good enough so that you'll rely on it to change the linguistic theories. Okay, that could well happen. So, for example, if priming, if linguists postulate two different kinds of empty elements, and priming studies show that they always work exactly the same way, as distinct from others, well, the linguists are going to have to rethink it. Maybe they made a mistake. You know? So there will come a time when, maybe it's there already, when the real-time processing experiments could very well bear on the theory of the computational structure. And that's one of the many, many areas of interaction which are very fruitful now. Luigi mentioned brain studies, child acquisition studies, real-time processing. All of this material is beginning to interact in ways that bear on the same questions from quite different points of view. And of course, that's very important. You know, then you can get confirmation and disconfirmation and new ideas and so on from other areas of evidence.
As far as I know, nobody denies that. And I think that the debate is very...
my point. My point is that Quine, though he's an anti-innatist, he attributes innate structure to the organism. He just does it arbitrarily. What he attributes is the radical translation paradigm.
The debate, to me, it's easy to understand. The debate is innate.
Sure, that's easy to understand. For example, here's something that could be understood. It's not Quine's position, but somebody could say, this was Hilary Putnam's position, there are generalized learning mechanisms. So Hilary Putnam was one of the early anti-innatists, and his position was there are generalized learning mechanisms which apply to all cognitive domains. They apply to language, to thinking, you know, to everything. And that's all. There's nothing special for language. Putnam is an example. Most psychologists have believed that. For example, Piaget believed that. Skinner certainly believed it. Whether Quine believed it is not so obvious, because he attributes specific structure to the language system, namely the radical translation paradigm, which doesn't look as if it's going to carry over to anything else. But if it does carry it over to other things, then he believes it too. So that's certainly a position that we can understand, but instantly reject. I mean, it's as if somebody can instantly, not even look at it for a moment. It makes exactly as much sense as if somebody said to the embryologist, you don't have to look at the instructions in the cell because there's a generalized growth pattern. There are generalized growth mechanisms, and they work for chickens, and they work for nematodes, and they work for people. So forget all your business about the genetic instructions in the cell. Makes exactly as much sense as that. It would make, a scientist wouldn't bother listening to the second one. And they would only listen to this one if somebody tells them what the generalized learning mechanisms are. So, okay, tell me what they are. Tell me what they are, and then I'll take a look. But then all of these people say, well, I can't tell you what they are. I just think they're there. At which point you say, well, I'm sorry, I'm going home. It's just pure irrationality. Now, it's very striking that, and incidentally, in the case of language, we have plenty of evidence that it's false. I mean, language has all kinds of properties that you don't find in other cognitive domains. I mean, it's just radically different from other cognitive domains in all kinds of respects. I mean, even its digital character, or its recursive enumerability, and on to much more complex properties. And we also have very strong evidence that these properties are universal, that they're just internal, which is why they show up in all languages. But somehow we're told we're not allowed to look at that. We must assume that there are generalized learning mechanisms, although I can't tell you what they are. Now, that's pretty irrational. When the position was stated by Nelson Goodman, who's another major philosopher, in fact, my own teacher, he pointed out something that in fact is plausible. He said, look, he doesn't see an alternative to the postulation of innate structure for language, but the fact that you can't find an alternative to a completely offensive and unacceptable view doesn't mean you have to accept that offensive and unacceptable view. Well, that's true enough. I mean, if the view that cognition is like everything else in the biological world is so offensive that you just can't accept it, okay, then don't accept it. I mean, it's like some 18th century physicist saying, I'm just not going to accept universal gravitation. It's too offensive. Well, okay. I mean, that ends the discussion. The discussion with Hilary Putnam, who I should say is an old personal friend of mine since high school, so we've argued about it personally as well as in print. That discussion rests with my question, what are the generalized learning mechanisms? And I don't see he has no answer to that. So that's the end of that discussion. The discussion with Quine can't get off the ground because he simply stipulates mechanisms and says you got to accept those, namely the radical translation ones. And he also insists that we treat the language learner and the linguist as following the same course, which makes no sense at all. And since that's what he insists on, all I can say is, well, if that's a game you want to play, okay. It doesn't have anything to do with any effort to understand the world or to solve philosophical problems. It's a game, which is going nowhere. And the same would then be true of Donald Davidson and Richard Rorty, and in fact anybody who takes that paradigm seriously, which is a very wide swathe. Yeah.
I didn't quite get the reasons why the philosophy
is dualism. Well, the thesis is that we're worried about there's a gap between the mental and the physiological, neurophysiological. It's true that we can't relate them, okay? We've got a theory of the mental, like some computational representational theory of the brain. We have a theory of the neurophysiological, like you go over to the brain science department and they'll tell you in great detail how synaptic connections work and you know, sodium ions move from here to there and all that kind of business. And we don't see any way of relating these two things. Okay, so that's the gap. Well, the slogan says the mental, that is what all of this stuff is talking about, is just the neurophysiological at a higher level. That is the neurophysiological, the business about synaptic connections. That's the answer. The mental is just some way of talking about that. Now, the reason why I think that's irrational is that these theories actually work. These theories don't in the relevant domain. I mean, these theories work fine for synaptic connections, but they tell you absolutely nothing about language. Zero. Okay. So that's the domain we're talking about. We're talking about the domain of language. So here we have a theory which tells you nothing about that domain. Here we have theories which tell you a lot about that domain. Now we're instructed that we must consider these theories to be just abstract versions of these theories. Now the rational approach would be to say, maybe instead of defining the mental, these are definitions, instead of defining the mental as some abstract version of the neurophysiological, what we could say is maybe the neurophysiological will turn out to be the relevant cellular structures for the I language, computational representational systems. So maybe in that sense the neurophysiological will turn out to be the mental at a lower level, but it's the mental we're secure about, not the neurophysiological. And maybe it won't, because there's no special reason to think that, say, synaptic connections are the relevant phenomenon. So it's dualistic in the sense that it's giving a priority to what people intuitively regard as physical, although I don't give any meaning to that, that it shouldn't have.
But most of the people